been out here writing software for about 25 years. I've personally founded 6 startups, which is a crazy number. 4 of them worked, had exits, so that's also a crazy number. One of them that exited well was this thing called Rightly that we sold to Google and became Google Docs. So it was one of my claim to fame is that I was the engineering director that put Google Docs together and handed it off internally. And then I was at Google for about 4 years, running a bunch of different consumer products there. Ultimately, like basically all the consumer products. So Blogger, Page Creator, Picasa, Calendar, Reader, and eventually I ran Gmail for about 1.5 years, which was a lot of fun. And we can talk about really, really big scale. If we want to talk about big technical scale with Gmail, I'm happy to answer questions about that. I used to joke about Gmail that it's not like turning a battleship. It's so big, it's kind of like trying to turn a mountain. Like it has roots. It's like it's a massive thing, so we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm currently the head of engineering at Box, so I get to work with Aaron Levy and see that part of the world. And Box is actually the first job I've ever actually taken. Everything else I've ever done was either the first job out of college I took, but then after that everything was being a founder or getting acquired or something like that. Another thing that's interesting, I spent a year at Google in the Ventures group, Google Ventures, as an investor. So I did a bunch of investments as well. So I've built, sold, and bought companies. And so I've seen that process of building startups and acquiring them from every direction. So I've acquired as many things at Box as I did at Google as well. One of the things I'm curious, like, how many of you are in a startup or founding a startup or thinking of founding a startup? Like, is this a good chunk of the crowd? Okay, a lot of folks. One of the things I was going to talk about a little bit was why startups. One of the things I think is interesting right now is that when I started doing a startup, my first startup, it was this really radical, scary thing. Like I got my math degree, and I went to work for this company called Ashton Tate, which doesn't exist anymore. And then, I worked there for about 1.5 years, and it was sort of falling apart. And we built this. My partner and I built this video game, which we really liked. And we built it because we loved it, and it was this cool thing to do, and we wanted to like shoot at each other. And it was the first network video game. It was really neat. And then we turned it into a company, and we decided to leave before Ashton Tate fell apart. And that was a really kind of scary, radical thing. So I got all of these people telling, like my parents and my friends, and my friends that were in big companies were all saying, like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you leaving to do a startup? Like, if it doesn't work, there'll be this horrible hole in your resume, and you'll never get a good corporate job again. And what's the matter with you? It's really terrible. Fast forward to now. And that same conversation happens in the other direction. I talk to these. I've been involved with StartX, the incubator out of Stanford, and the Stanford kids are like, I got to do a startup. I got to have a startup on my resume. If I don't have a startup on my resume, I'm totally damaged. It's like, I've got 5 years to do my first startup. So it's really interesting that it's kind of flipped around, and it's become this thing you have to do. And one of the things I think that's interesting about it is that when I did my first startup, I did it out of a sense of passion. Because I really like this product. And it's nice if you like your product, because at least one person likes your product. Like that's kind of a good place to start. A lot of people, I think, do startups now for these kind of more cynical reasons, like they're trying to make money, or they're trying to get flipped or acquired or whatever, or they're doing it because everybody else is doing it. And you get this kind of mass of these undifferentiated, uninteresting startups that come out of that there's not a lot of insight. So that's an interesting observation. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it a little bit is the startups that are really powerful and transformative, like the Rightly startup that we did, all have this very common property, and others have written about this. I'm not particularly unique about it, but it's that anything that's really disruptive, anything that's really new, always looks wrong at first. Always looks wrong, and for this very deep behavioral reason. If you find something that challenges your worldview, you have a choice, right? You can either decide that you are wrong, your worldview is wrong, and you can accept the fact that you're wrong, or you can say that the thing that challenges your worldview is wrong, you're right, and that thing is wrong. 95% of the time, 99% of the time, people make the second choice. They decide that thing is stupid, it can't possibly be right, I must be right, and so the new things that are actually disruptive look wrong. And so, if you're not passionately following something, if you aren't sure you're right, about this thing that everybody else tells you is wrong, you're unlikely to ever do anything that's really interesting. Now the problem with this is that the stupid ideas also look stupid at first, so it's not actually a good rule for finding things. So stupid ideas, don't just go do the stupid ideas, but that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. We had this experience with Rightly in spades. A year after I sold it to Google, people were still telling me it was a dumb idea, which I found fascinating. Like, you know, it's like, no, I'm done. Like, I sold it. People are using it. I've got 2 million users. I'm getting fan mail. It's a great idea. And I literally constantly got this stuff from reporters and from analysts and people in whose interest it was to not be challenged. Often looked at it and thought that was dumb. And so, you know, that was an easy one because we knew it was right because we had the check in the bank. But for any startup that actually matters and does something interesting, you're going to be challenged by it. So as you're thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, I would encourage you to think a little bit about, you know, whether you're passionate about it, because it's really hard to do startups, and you need to have that kind of that passion and that motivation to really go through this stuff. The one thing I always say, I like these little contradictions, these little Zen puzzles about startups. So I mean, your job as the founder is to be both infinitely flexible in response to market feedback and infinitely stubborn in response to, you know, with respect to your vision. You have to be both of these things that are completely contradictory at the same time. And that's kind of having that vision, having that passion is an important part of that. I mean, we're like, I was talking about the consumerized thing. We invest 10% of my engineering team is this thing that I call engineering services that does a continuous integration. So we're the only enterprise company I know that ships twice a day. Which is fast for an enterprise company, but really slow for a consumer company. So we're actually trying to push all the way to full CI. So that's pretty interesting. We do Agile. I've got 32 Scrum teams right now, I think is the number. So a lot of little Scrum teams all over the place. Nothing super formal. Like, we don't do Agile with a capital A, but everybody's on a 2-week cycle, and we, you know, do mostly the Scrum methodology. Every team tweaks it a little bit to suit their needs. We let them do that. We've got some really cool tech. We've got, you know, when I started there a year and a half ago, we had like 3,000 unit tests. We have like 50,000, and they run in 60% of the time. So we've done a huge amount of work to do like incremental execution and build out the clusters and stuff like that. We do this thing I call a performance ratchet. So we're trying to constantly improve performance. So every time we make a performance gain so that we don't lose it, we ratchet down the acceptable level for that performance metric, and then no check-in that breaks that is allowed to go in. So, like, you know, we like ratchet down the amount of CSS, and we ratchet down the page load time, and we just generally put this downward pressure on everything to make it higher performance. We do a bunch of different stuff like that. Yeah, it's about metaphor. Yeah. We'll be clicking on folders when we're traveling between the stars, I'm convinced. Like, it's just a nice metaphor. I think people are comfortable with it. And one of the things about innovation, so I was talking about how like new things appear wrong and all that stuff. One of the things that's interesting about innovation, there's a great book, if you haven't read it, Stephen Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From, I think is the title, Where Ideas Come From. He talks a lot about the mechanics of innovation and creativity. It's a very, very good book to read. He talks about the adjacent possible. So this is why things all tend to happen, inventions tend to happen in clusters, is that you can, you know, there's sort of the set of things that are possible right now, and then there's a set of adjacencies that's sort of one mutation off from that. So one idea away from what we know right now. And it's very hard to go more than one jump, you know, into the unknown. So the adjacent possible is where all the innovation happens. So, you know, people don't see television coming 4 steps ahead. They step one step at a time up to inventing television, then 10 people invent it all at once because it's the next step ahead. So, like, I think that you can't jump too far is kind of the answer, right? Like, you have to bring the audience along with you. And we did Rightly, we did, like, you know, it's a word processor, right? How hard is that? But it's in the browser. That's totally weird. Is that a web page or is it an application? I don't know what the fuck that is. Like, that was just one step, and even that took people like 3 years to figure out how to deal with it. So you can't do stuff that's a bunch of jumps. Yeah, I mean, my creativity is fingers. I think with my fingers usually. I mean, I really come at these. So I don't know that you can really do this as much anymore because I think the market is very crowded. It's hard to find things this way, but I tend to think with my fingers. I tend to build stuff that I find interesting. I like technology and I explore it. So, you know, I just have been very immersed in technology since I got out of college and just have been having a lot of fun writing software and following along as the industry goes through its various transformations and stuff like that. So that's what I encourage on my team is, I love side projects. We do hacking days, we do hackathons where we stay up all night writing code. I was really pleased the last time we did a hackathon, there was a programming contest that I won, which was kind of amusing. They didn't think I could still write code, and I beat them all. It was really awesome. We had people who were friendly with us and got us PR for sure. Yeah, I mean, like I didn't have PR people working for me, but you know, like the Rightly startup, there's a kind of a funny story that I've told before. So we met Michael Arrington very early in TechCrunch. So I think we were like the 30th thing he wrote about or something. Like there were like a couple thousand people reading it. I hadn't heard of it when somebody introduced me to him. And we went and met him. At the time, he was thinking about doing this like online presentation thing, or TechCrunch. He couldn't decide which thing he wanted to do. So I actually met him at Bucks, and we talked about whether we should join forces or whether he should go do his TechCrunch thing. So I didn't head off TechCrunch. I'm sorry. We said no, but he wrote about us, and that got us a lot of attention really quickly, and that definitely got us on Google's radar very early, and got us, and that was Rightly was one of these weird things where we just happened to be exactly at the right place at the right time. It was one of the craziest rides I've ever had. But we popped up on Google's radar when they were trying to figure out how to deal with Microsoft putting search on the desktop. So that was very much top of mind at the highest level, and it was on Eric Schmidt's mind. He had been burned by Microsoft before, so he was interested in figuring out what to do about it. And so we were just like the perfect thing that got it. So there was a little bit of PR around that, but nothing formal. I'm an engineer. I just write stuff. I don't actually do anything more subtle than that.
So you mentioned a couple times, it's as if you feel that the current startup market field is kind of saturated. Just, a lot of this.
I don't know, it's saturated. It's a big market. It's crowded.
On the other hand, you've also mentioned that you feel that it's kind of like in the PC times where the technology is changing rapidly.
Yeah.
And there will be new opportunities.
Yeah, both are true. I mean, both. So what's up with me?
But both are true. So that said, is there something that we're waiting for to happen? Something's going to flip that's going to open new avenues?
No, I mean, I think there are. I think things are open now. I think this platform is opening up a lot of opportunity. I do think the market is really crowded. I think there feels like there are more startups going on now than there used to be, and it's definitely the case. What's definitely true is the startup culture is much more sophisticated than it used to be, right? If you want to, you can get really educated before you do anything. And there's a lot of kind of known best practices about how to fund things, how to structure things, how to get started, what technologies to use. There's all this acceleration around hosted services that get you really down the road really quickly. There's things like the app stores that get you distribution really quickly. So it's just faster now, and it's much, much more competitive. When I was doing most of my startups, nobody knew anything. Like there was nobody doing any startups. The market was way smaller, but almost any insight was a valuable insight. Whereas now I think it's more like we've gone from the amateur phase and we're shifting into the professional phase, where you really have to have your act together and be a professional entrepreneur and really do a lot of research and be very sharp to stay on top of the market, as opposed to just sort of wandering into stuff. Yeah.
What do you look for in the relationship between a technical co-founder and sort of a business co-founder? Is that something you've dealt with?
Oh, I had this written. I was going to talk about this. Yeah, I was going to write this down, actually. I wrote it down. I was going to talk about it. I forgot. You should find a co-founder that you like to argue with. That's my one piece of advice. Find somebody that you really like arguing with, because you are going to argue with them a lot, in my experience. So seriously, that's it was a joke, but it's actually true. Co-founder is a very intense relationship. So the relationship part of it is actually almost as important as the competence. You're asking more about skills and competence, and you're asking for kind of a recipe.
What the relationship should look like?
Well, I actually co-founded all 6 of those companies with the same person, and we fight like brothers. We have known each other for a long time, so we're very symbiotic. So that's the things I would say is find somebody who's complementary. Steve is a much better programmer than I am, and so I'm like kind of the mouthy creative one, and he's the dude who actually gets stuff done more. So that's a nice complementary pair. But you want to look for, there's usually like a quiet one and a loud one. You want to look for complementary skills. You want to look for a business person that you can work with as an equal. It feels like an equal, feels like a peer, feels like it's an equal relationship, in my opinion. As regards to founding teams, I'm a huge believer in 2. I'm a maybe sometimes believer in 3, and I'm not really a believer in anything more than that. 3 is actually kind of dangerous because every 3-person founding team I've seen has at some point gotten into this pattern where 2 of the 3 people think something is a great idea, and the third one is like, well, I don't really agree with that much, but I guess I'll just go along for it. And that's just a really shitty place to be. You don't really get an effective result if one person is not that happy. And I've seen teams where that cycles, where it's like, this person's unhappy, these people like it, and then this person's unhappy, and these people like it. Like they kind of shift ideas around, and they never find anything. That's right, which is the Primadonna death spiral. So this is something I learned about when I was an investor. I got called in a lot because I was an operator. I got called in to debug companies. And I saw this pattern so often that I gave it that name. So this happens early on. So if you're doing a startup and you're at the 8 to 10 person stage and you're struggling with scale, you may be suffering from this. So this pattern is basically you start the company off with probably one really strong technical person. Maybe there's a couple of them, but one of them's more strong than the other. If there's 2 really strong technically capable people in the company, this usually doesn't happen. Usually you get one guy who feels guy or gal who feels a lot of responsibility for things and takes a lot of the load on. And then as the company starts to scale, you start to hire in people around them. And that person is the prima donna. And that person, as they come in, makes this very rational short-term decision that's very irrational long-term. And the short-term decision is, well, crap, I've got all this stuff to do. I've got these new people. They don't really know anything. They're going to take longer and do the job worse than I will do. So I'm just going to do it for them. This also happens in bigger companies and teams in big companies, but it happens a lot in startups. So these people come in, they're not that great because I can do the stuff better, and then I'm not giving them stuff to do. I'm not delegating to them, and they don't actually learn. And so that's the death spiral, right? The less they get trusted, the less trustworthy they are. Keep adding people to it. Eventually, you get to about 8 to 10 people. The guy or gal in the middle is carrying the load, although this is almost always guys. The guy in the middle is carrying the load and is sort of making up for the fact that the team around him isn't particularly functional, and eventually at about 8 to 10, it starts to break. The CEO, the business guy, doesn't understand why he can't add engineers and make the company go faster, because every time he adds an engineer, it kind of slows down, and there's all this angst around it and all this other stuff. So if you've seen this pattern, or you think you see this pattern forming, it's very common. It's something that happens a lot at that stage. There are different dysfunctions that happen at different stages of companies, and I can talk about the stuff that happens at 50 and the stuff that happens at 200 and things like that. But the prima donna death spiral, which I am starting either a band or a restaurant with that. I'm not sure which.
In situations like that, what advice do you give when you see companies falling into that cycle?
They're hard. I mean, it depends on where they are in the process. So one of the things I talk a lot about with my team, what's related to this, is the concept of humility in leadership. It sounds kind of like a funny thing, but I'm kind of an accidental engineering leader. I got acquired. I'd never had done engineering leadership before I got to Google, and I got to be a director sort of by mistake. It's a long story, but I think I'm one of the few people who's done that that way. And so I never cared that much about it. I would give a lot of stuff away, and I discovered the power of being kind of humble and not territorial and not arrogant in leadership. So that prima donna death spiral comes from a sense of arrogance at some level. It comes from the prima donna being arrogant about their ability and not willing to delegate and kind of be humble about that delegation. So mostly what you wind up doing is you coach them on that stuff. You get to understand the pattern and understand why it's not working. And then you have to really work with the CEO. There's usually a bunch of dysfunctions around that. There's usually a CEO that just wants to go, go, go. And the guy in the middle is trying really hard to deliver that. And so they're making this short-term versus long-term trade-off in the wrong direction. So you have to get the CEO to understand, there's like this adage, slow down, it goes faster. Like this is definitely where it applies. You have to get the CEO to understand that he has to slow down, have to invest in the team, you have to invest in the scale and be able to actually let the company scale up and develop its skills. And if they can get their head around it, if both of them get their head around it, you can kind of unwind it. You have a period where everything slows down because you're deliberately not you're not helping out. You're letting the folks around the center person learn the job and struggle and sometimes fail, and that takes time. So it's hard to do. I mean, it's definitely a hard transformation. It's better if you never get into it in the first place. Sometimes if it gets too tight, you just have to have the guy in the middle leave, and then you really slow down while everybody picks the pieces up. That happens too. People just blow out of it because they just get it's too crazy, it's too much scar tissue, it just breaks. So that's an interesting one too.
Do you have any examples of Primadonnas you've identified?
Oh, totally. I'm not going to name any of them.
To correct or
Yeah, like a dozen. I mean, a bunch of them. Like I can't name names, but I had somebody on the Gmail team that wound up having to leave because I couldn't get it untangled. That was the first one I saw. I had a bunch of companies I saw do this when I was at Google Ventures. Where I did sometimes untangle them. Sometimes I couldn't untangle them, and people wound up leaving the company over it. It causes a lot of damage if it goes on for a long time. So it's definitely a pattern I talk about it a lot, and I think it's a pattern that's worth knowing and watching. Yeah.
Have you seen sort of character personalities at the time of hiring to predict that?
Yeah, I mean, hiring, we could talk about hiring for a couple of hours. Hiring is so important. We do, a little bit. I mean, it's hard to test for this stuff. You can ask these behavioral questions to try to suss some of this stuff out. What you're looking for are people, there's an element of ego, I think, is what you're kind of looking for. So people who have a high degree of ownership, which is something you do want, but people who are kind of arrogant about it. So you often, like one of the signals you see is often bitching a lot about the last place they were at. So if you hear somebody complaining a lot that the people that they're working with now or were working with before were stupid or made dumb decisions or there's like that sense of arrogance about like I'm smarter than everybody else. That's usually one of the things that tips you over into being the prima donna. So we look for that stuff. It's hard to catch this stuff. I mean, hiring is crazy hard to really get it right. Like, people are on their best behavior. It's a squishy art anyways. You never know how people are going to really be until they're in the context and settle in after a few weeks, whatever. So it's definitely, yeah, I mean, the culture emerges from the teams. You can sort of try to describe it. I think culture kind of emerges out of who you are. Like, we were always very engineering centric and really passionate about engineering and building products. So we got people that wanted to do that with us. Box is a culture right now that's very open and collaborative and friendly. And so we tend to not hire people that have sharp edges because they don't get along very well and we don't like them that much. So you kind of get these, Jeff Bezos has this great thing about, culture. You get your culture in your first 100 people and then you're done. Like once you get 100 people, whatever culture you have established is the culture your company will have forever. Because new people will tissue reject back out if they're significantly different. You can kind of slowly drift, but if you're very deliberate about it, but you can't make radical changes once you have some amount of mass. I mean, there's definitely these waves of scale that you see. Like there's a scale around 10 to 12 people, 15 people where you start to get the first managers that really run things. And then, yeah, that number 50 to 100 is a pretty interesting range as well because you start adding managers and that's okay. But you get to you can have somewhere between 5 and 15 people per manager maybe. So you get to 50 to 100 managers, you're up to about 10 managers at that point. So now you have to start thinking about, maybe not that many, maybe it's 5 if you're conservative, but you start having to think about hierarchy, like multiple levels of management, or maybe you do the holacracy thing, which is kind of crazy and cool, but you still have to think about some way to get some scale in there. The interesting thing that happens is you can be flat for a while, and you can, at 100 people, everybody can know what everybody's doing, and you can generally know what the code base is. Everybody can understand where everything is. And many companies go through that phase and stay flat. But when you get to about 200 people, 150 to 200 people, you see this very common pattern of companies really struggling to scale because people are starting to break stuff. They don't know where everything is. They can't communicate with each other. You can't do the many-to-many problem anymore. You can't keep it in your head. You're hitting Dunbar's number where nobody knows everybody anymore. It gets really hard. And you can, if you look, you can read about this. I mean, LinkedIn went through this. Facebook went through this. Twitter went through this. Like a bunch of companies get to this crisis point. And it's always around the same number. It's always somewhere between 150 and 200 engineers. They sort of have to stop and rethink everything and rebuild their processes and then move forward. It's pretty interesting. So there's definitely patterns like that happen. The startup within a startup thing works pretty well. You can go for a long time with it. I think that's much more about the style of management than the organization per se. It's whether the managers empower people to make decisions and let people be creative and take risks, and you celebrate the right kinds of failure and things like that to keep being a startup. But it's hard. I mean, it's really hard to keep that startup culture for a long time.
Have you witnessed like communication between like within startups? Because you can think you work on what initially is the same product, and now you have kind of like two churches within the same company.
Yeah, we're doing this right now. Like we're doing this very deliberate strategy in Box where we're building this really core functionality group that's just the business logic for the whole platform, for the whole product. And then it's got individual like client products on top. So like our desktop stuff is a product group, and the web stuff is a product group, and this content creation thing we're working on is a product group, and like they're all separate pieces. So that's, you know, there's communication through that core, and then there's communication back and forth across them, but they're kind of semi-autonomous. So you have to wind up doing modularity. That's really the only solution. At some level, you have to modularize things so that there's some isolation, there's some boundaries where people can understand their domain reasonably well and not have to worry about the whole puzzle.
Consistency, do you guys try to swap people from one group
We let
to
people
the
swap
other?
around, yeah. We let people move around. And one of my biggest beliefs, so I spent 20 years indulging myself, basically. I built, every startup I did because I wanted to do it, because I wanted to work on whatever it was. You know, I don't think you can do that anymore, but I got away with it for a long time. And so, but one of the lessons from that is that, again, passion is really important. Like you let people work on the things that they're really passionate about. You know, I always believe that engineers should work on what they want to work on. There's this really interesting, this is another, it goes back to the humility and leadership thing. It's really easy when you're leading a big engineering organization to get in this mindset of, you've got all these problems all day long. Like people come to you with problems. And so you got to solve all these problems. And you get in this mindset of, the org exists to solve my problems. Like the group of people exists to solve my problems. So you start doing things like, well, I need a manager over here. This person doesn't really want to be a manager, but I'll push them into being a manager because I really need a manager. And so before long, you get a lot of unhappy people because of that. And the reality of this is that, you know, if you're in my position at the head of a 200-person organization, you're the least important person, not the most important person. Right? I don't write any code. I'm the least important person. I just support all of them. And so, you know, I exist to solve the problems of the org, not the other way around. And so part of that is just I let people move and do whatever they want, solve problems how they want to solve them. I try to help make them understand, you know, you try to be as transparent as you can as a leader, let people understand what the goals are, what the constraints are. If you have to tell them, no, you can't do that because something else is more important, you do. But that should be relatively rare. If you have smart people, they'll figure it out. And then where the gaps are is my job to go figure out how to kind of fill that stuff in. So it's really easy to feel like a dictator, like you know better, and kind of push people around to do stuff, but you get way better results if you let people do what they think is the right thing to do. So my job is to communicate so that people can figure that stuff out. You know, I can go on for a long time about the humility and leadership thing, but it winds up sounding like a humble brag, so it's this weird sort of, and I do it really well, which is like the meta humble brag. Put your hand up if anything I'm saying seems particularly stupid and you want to challenge me, or if you want to ask questions. I don't mind being called stupid. I actually tell my team all the time that they can call me stupid if they want to. So we're going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I saw as a VC. So this is going to be a bunch of stuff about startups, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see in the enterprise space, because that was listed on the thing as one of the things I'm going to talk about. So I'll talk about it for a minute. I mean, none of this stuff is stuff that you haven't heard before, so I feel a little bit guilty going through it. But, you know, as a VC, I saw a lot of stuff like, you know, people don't really talk to customers, right? This is like really basic stuff, right? Go read the lean startup stuff if you haven't read it. You know, it's a really good guide to finding product market fit. You know, it's a really basic stuff, and talk to customers. People get in love with what they're building, which is natural because you're passionate and stubborn about the thing you're building. That's part of your job, but you have to actually understand what's going on in the market. I'm a little bit of a contrarian about VCs. Are there any VCs in the audience? Do I get to be okay? I don't have to be too polite. Sometimes I do these things at incubators, and there's like 3 or 4 VCs, and I'm telling these like anti-VC things. You know, I tell entrepreneurs all the time, one of the things that frustrates me a little bit about the venture world in the Valley right now is that VCs have a slightly different agenda than you do. It's sort of like, I worked briefly when I was in college for a taxi company, and the way the taxi companies work, pre-Uber is, and they still work like this, is you rent the cab from them as a driver, right? So you pay a fixed fee for the cab, and then you have to go hustle business. So the incentives are misaligned. The taxi company just wants to rent out as many cabs as they can, and left to their own devices, they'll flood the market and nobody actually makes their rental fee back. But it's fine for them because they're renting these out, and they kind of naturally gravitate to these very thin margins at the end of the day. So it's not exactly what's going on in the venture world, but it's kind of what's going on in the venture world. The VCs make money from startups. They make money from getting to play the game. So it's in their interest to cover the world with startups and have there be a lot of them. And so this kind of goes back to my earlier thing about why are you doing a startup? I think you get all this brand building and press and writing that venture guys do these days, and they write about how cool it is to be to do a startup and how cool it is to get into a startup. And it is, and it can be a lot of fun, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And so I think there's like this overselling of, you got to go do a startup, you got to do this thing, you got to be an entrepreneur. And it's not necessarily aligned with your interests the way you might necessarily think it is. So. Oh, yeah, it's mostly team. How do you decide what to invest in as a VC? It's mostly, for me, it was mostly team and team first, right? Whether the team seemed to understand what they were doing, had some good track record, could present well. A lot of it was just literally like, it sounds kind of funny, but if you show up in a venture office and, we had the saying, past is prologue, right? So, what you see at the beginning is likely to be the interaction over time. So somebody shows up at your office, they knew they were coming there. They had time to prepare, presumably. They bring their stuff in. They sit down if they're late, if they're disorganized, if they can't tell their story, if I surprise them with a competitor they haven't heard of, if I ask them a question they hadn't considered, any of this stuff that shows kind of that they're unprepared, I tend to not be interested, right? Like, you're on the stage, you're performing, you're being asked to perform, and you'll be asked to perform on a daily basis. You'll be asked to have your shit together as an entrepreneur in front of customers, in front of other investors, in front of whatever. If you can't get it together to come to an investor meeting and present well, you're probably not going to be a successful team, right? So that even basic stuff like that of just how do you show up, and you can just tell, like some teams show up and they're all over the place and they don't really have it thought out, and some teams show up and they're right there, and you cannot poke a hole in anything. You have to go do your research before you can say no. Those are tough. So anyways, I'm a little bit skeptical of this kind of tide of people that want to go do companies and do startups like that. So, I saw that a little bit when I was a VC. I always tell people that when I talk about this stuff because I think it's interesting to have the contrary voice. The one person I've read who's actually honest about this, who's a VC, is Mark Suster. He writes a lot about, like, are you really an entrepreneur? Do you really want to do this stuff? The other thing I would say is just, this is really obvious, like, get educated. Use all the financial tools. You have great tools now. When I started doing startups, it sucked. VCs were really annoying. They were like these white shoe jerks. They didn't want to actually talk to you. They were like bankers from the East Coast. They didn't get anything. The guys who really get it now, there's a lot more instruments. You can scale your startup in a lot of different ways. Get educated about that. If you don't understand what a convertible note is at this point, or how to do a syndicated angel round or something like that, you should. That's kind of an obvious thing. Kind of like two other things. When I was a VC, my job was basically to figure out how to say no. So if you're talking to a VC, you got to get through all the no's. You got to give them a reason to say yes, get them comfortable saying yes, because mostly what you do when you're a VC is say no. So that was a little bit surprising to me. And my other piece of advice on VCs is just, I don't understand why anybody would take money from somebody who wasn't an operator or an entrepreneur in a prior life. I don't understand why there are any VCs now that are pure MBAs. There are so many people out there who actually understand the job better. So anyways, I'm totally not risk averse. Like, I would not do the Box thing. Like, Box is a big, interesting, hard challenge for me, so it's totally not. Box is, I get asked that question a lot. Part of it is just, I've done 6 startups. Startups are really hard. If you haven't done one, they're actually really hard. They're hard because on any given day, you can get up and do anything, which means you don't know if anything you're doing is actually the right thing to do. There's no anchor until you actually get traction. And by the time you get traction, then you have competitors. And so now you're sweating out competitors, stuff like that. There's no easy, and you tell me, like, are startups easy? Like, they're not that easy, right? They're hard. And I've done 6 of them. I've been very proud of all of them. They've been a lot of fun. They're kind of lonely too. So when I went to Google, I got a taste for being in a larger context and running bigger teams, realized I was reasonably good at doing that. So I liked that, and then I left and did a bunch of coaching with small teams because I didn't want to really start another thing. And I sort of missed being with teams when I was doing the investor thing, and that was also kind of too lonely for me. So I like Aaron, I like the space. I think it's a challenging puzzle. I think it's a fun company. It's a great culture. Like, it was just and it's close to my house, and It was just a bunch. It was like, he's a really interesting guy, and so it's like, yeah, whatever. That's easy. That makes sense. It sounds like a fun thing to do, and it's exactly the scale that I wanted to be. It was 100 people now. It's 100 engineers now. It's 200 engineers. So it's a really nice size if you've run bigger organizations. I ran Gmail out of 8 offices simultaneously. It was 200 people directly under me and another 400 indirectly. It was just a beast. I didn't even know all the people who were working for me. So something like Box is really nice because it's personal and intimate, and you can see all the stuff that's going on. But also, I just don't like the market right now, to be honest. It's just too crazy. There's too many companies floating around with tons and tons of money that are just super fast followers. So it's hard to find anything that's clear space, and then when you do, it's very hard to stay ahead. It just feels like really high beta, like you're just pulling lottery tickets. So yeah.
But to that point, I mean, you had said earlier when you were doing VC stuff that you predominantly said no. And it sounds like that's what a lot of VCs.
You have to. I mean, you see more deals than you can say yes to.
There's a lot of yes.
There's definitely a lot of yes.
It's like becoming a lot more.
Yeah.
You
This is.
you're like, well, how did that get funded? And so.
Yeah, totally.
I'm kind of curious,
This was one of my.
VC community much more liberal with their money, or there's just a lot more companies that are being qualified?
There's definitely a lot of money floating around. There's definitely the ability to fund more stuff because I think it's, well, for a while there was at least. I think the seed stuff is slowing down a little bit, but for a long time, it's just like the seeds are so cheap that, I was part of Google Ventures. They had a $300 million a year fund, and we were doing seed investment at $100K a pop for the seeds. Like you got to do a lot of those to use up $300 million, right? So it's almost infinite. You can do a lot of them. You want to do return. You don't want to just throw money around. You want to get returns on it. But one of the things that I don't like, I'm a cranky old man. Like you guys should probably not listen to most of this stuff because I'm like an old poop. So take it with a grain of salt. But one of the things I did not like being an entrepreneur in the dot-com boom, which I think that this current era shares to some degree, is there is a lot of money in early stage, and so you wind up competing with a lot of kind of dumb money. In the dot-com era, there were like, the stupid Super Bowl ads, and the companies that were like, I'll sell you a dollar for 90 cents. Like, how many do you want? You just can't compete with that stuff. Like eventually, like that like the idea is there, and like there's a market there, but those fuckers are going to go out of business, and they're going to totally overshadow you until they are out of business. So there's a bit of that going on. It's not as bad now, I think, as it used to be, but there's definitely a lot of like crazy fast money floating around out there. So I don't know the answer. I've been out of venture I was only in it for a year. I've been out of it for longer than I was in it, and I'm happily not paying that much attention to it. So I may be fairly stale at this point on that side. But I was going to talk a little bit about enterprise, what I've seen. So I've done a lot of consumer stuff. Box is an enterprise company. It's kind of an unusual enterprise company in that it's very consumer focused at the same time. And so, you've heard this phrase, consumerization of enterprise, probably. It seems a bit trite, but it's actually very real. We see it a lot. And what it really means is, the fact that you can carry your own connectivity in your pocket into the office and not have to deal with whatever the CIO wants you to deal with is super powerful. And it's enabling to end users, and it's disrupting a lot of stuff in the enterprise. The really interesting thing is that mobile plus the cloud together are a platform of the order of the PC, right? So when the PC showed up, everything changed because it enabled this whole new set of behavior, and it just upended all of the companies before it. The same thing is happening in enterprise. We see this happening in enterprise massively. And I think the same way this happened with the PC, I think we're at the very, very beginning of a very long, 30-year transformation of how business is done, how work happens, how software is built, how it's delivered, how people choose it, the way the market competes, the way you interact with other things. So I think a lot of things haven't emerged yet. We think a lot about how productivity tools will work in the world where you can assume that everybody has a connected device in their pocket. How content works. Obviously, Box is a content company, so we think a lot about how content works in a world where you have to deal with all these devices and all this fragmentation and everything's kind of high velocity. There's a lot of trends in here that we can talk about. One of the things I've seen over literally the last 20 years on documents in particular and productivity tools in particular is there's this swing from formality and artifact where we started off with literal sheets of paper, then we had desktop publishing, which was really cool because you didn't have to type anymore. but we still had these things that were like business letters that kind of have over time evolved from formality and artifact and into communication and velocity being the central feature of this stuff. And I think there's a lot of things to be explored around that. One of the things I was going to say was, this is what I did this talk on. It's kind of a funny thing for me to do, right? It's like paper, this old technology. And I was thinking about like, why did I do this? And like, I was going to talk a little bit about it. And paper is kind of interesting, right? So when you write on paper, it sucks, right? It totally sucks. Like it's lossy. I write stuff into it, I can barely read it back out. I can't mail things, I can't back them up, really. I can't do anything interesting with it, I can't shuffle it. But I still like to use it, and the reason I like to use it is, when I'm writing, it interacts with my executive function a little bit. I have to pay attention to my hand and my pen. It distracts me a little bit, it frees up part of my brain. It slows me down a little bit, so the freed up part of my brain has a little bit of time to think and be creative. And so I get a little bit better flow, I get a little bit better creativity out of it. So the technology really interacts with me as I'm doing things, and I actually get a different result. And so for this, the reason I wrote this, which I almost never do, I almost always type stuff, the reason I wrote it was I wanted to have that rhythm and flow of kind of brainstorming what I wanted to talk about. And I knew that technology would enable that for me. So the lesson from that is we're technological creatures, right? Like we are, the most basic technology in the world is fire. You need fire to digest food. Like we don't have enough gut to actually digest raw food very well without a lot of processing. So every technology we have is a loop with us. It interacts with us. Mobile and cloud are the same way. They change our behaviors. They change the way we look at things. They change the way we interact with things. They change the way we think about things. And you guys all know this, right? Your behavior is so different than it was 5 years ago, because you can pull your phone out in a line when you're bored. You can ask a question in a restaurant if you don't know the answer to it, or like whatever, right? You can do all these interesting things that you do now. That, I think, if you're looking for ideas and places to watch for this huge transformation happening, that's the thing to think about. Like how does the technology change my behavior? Sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's trite. Like if you look at something like Uber, I was thinking about as an example, it's not just this mechanical thing of I can go get a cab. It's that now that's so easy and so reliable to do this, it's starting to change social behaviors around this stuff. You have this kind of interesting interaction of how people are using these things differently. So
people shifting from PC to mobile?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see a lot. I mean, I talked about at the beginning of the consumerization of the enterprise. Choice is a huge deal. Like, it used to be the case that you could sell to the CIO, and who gives a damn about the end user? Like, that used to be an easy thing to do, right? Sell to the CIO, they'll just shove it down their end user's throat. You're only solving that guy's problem. You don't care about anybody else. That does not work anymore. What happens if you do that is you sell to the CIO, nobody uses it. They go use your competitor and has a better user experience. And a year later, the CIO rips you out and hires your competitor or finds some other solution. So you definitely have to pay a lot of attention to user experience in the enterprise space. We see one of the really exciting things that we see, though, is mobility is enabling people to be information workers in ways that you never saw before. And this is, when I was talking earlier, I had that kind of weird, blowsy, woozy thing about, think about how technology interacts with the person and, that loop and the fire and the raw food thing. This is a great example of it, right? This technology is changing the way businesses are able to behave. Like, this is kind of a trivial example, but it's a cool one. We have one of our customers is a heavy equipment rental company, and so they used to have like the guys that go out in the trucks to drop off the bulldozers have to take the contracts and the manuals and the copies of the manuals and get things signed and take pictures of everything and make sure you sign off and like there's no dents and here's all where the dents are and blah, blah, blah. And now they go out with an iPad, all the shit. We have partners like DocuSign's a partner, so they sign the contracts digitally. They can distribute all the materials that the foreman needs to his iPad. They can take pictures of the thing when they drop it off. They take pictures of the thing when they pick it up. It's a totally different experience. That guy's now an information worker, right? He's plugged into these tools in a really deep way, and like that. And this just goes everywhere. Like, we've got Red Bull's a customer. They use this thing to do distribution of content to all of their reps in the field. They used to be able to do stuff like that. So in just lots of ways, you see mobile pulling information and content out of the enterprise and putting it everywhere in the company, and basically everyone's as an information worker now. That's totally different than 5 years ago. So just like the desktop, the PC, like let everybody have a computer and be a computer expert and do like spreadsheets and stuff on the desktop and be smart and have like higher output. Like the same thing is happening with mobile, like one level down. Thanks for putting up with the ranting and the weirdness and the cranky old man and the crazy ideas about VC and the boring questions and all, or whatever. Anyways, thanks for having me.